And we're then ready for our next speaker. Ryan Smith, are you with us?
I am.
Fantastic. I love your background. I wonder where that comes from. Very interesting. Great. And your presentation looks fantastic. Take it away whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you all in Copenhagen today, but excited to be part of such a great group and really excited to be at this conference. So my name is Ryan Smith, and today the topic of the conversation is going to be discussing a relatively new algorithm called the Dunedin pace of aging metric. And this is a little bit different than some of those other epigenetic methylation trained algorithms in that it reads out not an overall biological age, but sort of a speedometer of aging, how many biological years per year you're currently aging. We're all here to discuss ways to sort of improve age and age-related phenotypes, and I think that this can significantly add to that conversation due to some of the advantages it has with some of the other methylation-related algorithms. And so, really excited to talk. And before I go into the algorithm itself, just want to give a little bit of background on our company. We are an epigenetic methylation diagnostic company. We have a 20,000 square foot CLIA certified lab here in the United States. We started doing commercial tests last July and have done since then right around 13,000 patients, and have multiple research trials and algorithms on the way and in publication. And so we're very excited to talk about this algorithm in particular because we have licensed this algorithm from Duke in all verticals and are applying it to the majority of our market. And our market really is 98% clinical providers. And so this algorithm is currently being used in practice to help guide treatments to treat age and age-related phenotypes. And so we're learning a lot of lessons, and hopefully we can convey some of those to everyone here today. And so in order to start, the other things I want to accomplish from this talk today is just sort of talking about how this was created, talk about sort of the benefits and disadvantages when compared to other aging algorithms, talk about what we know via some of our studies and personalized interventions, and what will predispose us to faster aging rates and what will actually slow that aging process. So hopefully we'll go through all of those. And before we talk about sort of the interventions, I think it's important to talk about how this metric was created. This metric was created based off of a really, really interesting cohort. This cohort sort of started in Dunedin, New Zealand in 1972 and really started enrolling patients in 1975. And they enrolled over 1,000 patients who were over just at that time 3 years of age. And so this is a cohort that has been tracked their entire lives with a biobank and also collecting a lot of these blood-based biomarkers. And so it represents a different group than most of the algorithms have traditionally been trained on, which represent a multitude of different individuals at a multitude of different age groups. This is a longitudinal cohort, which is really interesting for this. And this work was really, this cohort started to be picked up by researchers at Duke University whenever this cohort was about 30 years old. And they wanted to investigate how aging rates in younger populations could affect aging throughout a life course. And that eventually, or first, whenever they applied for funding in this area, the National Institute of Aging thought it was a really poor idea and that there would be no variation in aging rates in age 30 and below. And if there was, it would be insignificant to the aging process. And I think that what we found is that's definitely not true. And so this algorithm was created much like most of these other aging algorithms. There was sort of this four-step approach where they first collected the information via this Dunedin longitudinal cohort. And then with that, they started to do the typical things you would do for most of these age-related algorithms, which is sort of, I should say, some of the biomarkers collected for this in step one were generally revolved around 19 different blood-based biomarkers. This included things like, HSCRP, things like leukocyte telomere length, lung functioning measurements, cardiometabolic measurements, among others. And with this, they were able to sort of create this phenotypic score. If anyone is familiar with PhenoAge, it's very similar to that, where they created this sort of pace of aging metric via this sort of mathematical equation. And they calculated the 19 growth curves for each of these biological measurements. And the resulting score represents the gradual change in those 19 biomarkers coordinated with change in relationship to the others. And so if you can see here that on the right of this, you can see some people would almost 2 years per chronological year, and other people would age less than almost half a year per chronological year. And so this was how they created that measurement via blood-related metrics. And then with that, they started to, like most of the other epigenetic methylation algorithms, start to use an elastic net regression model to train the methylation to predict this. And there have actually been several variations of this, and also several variations of the naming. And so you might see it referenced in my presentations or in publications as the dundedinPoAm, or pace of aging metric, with a year denoted after it. So the last variation was the dundedinPoAm 38, and the newest one is the dundedinPoAm 35, which is now titled the Dunedin pace. And so that's the terminology I'll use for this. The idea, though, is that this cohort will continue to be tested as they age, to improve the algorithm across age, and to really to inform it to make it more predictive of this rate of aging. And so once they had this elastic net regression model, the fourth step in that process is validation. And that's what we're going to be talking about for the majority of today. We're going to be talking about really the 5 different studies which they did this in. And the first one was actually its own group, looking at how the rates of aging determined it at sort of the 38-year age range for these participants, predicted functional outcomes at age 45. We'll also talk about how the researchers applied this Dunedin pace of aging to a second cross-sectional study of adults to evaluate the Dunedin pace by chronological age, sex, and to test correlations with other self-reported metrics, as well as looking at normative Asian populations to see how it affected disease and mortality rates, and then also looking at even younger patient populations in early life adversity to see how they were impacted. And then lastly, how that essentially impacted caloric restriction. Obviously, caloric restriction has been a big topic throughout this conversation, and there's some really exciting metrics with this algorithm applied to that 25% caloric restriction over the course of 2 years. And so to start, I think it's important to talk about the validation within the study group itself. How were those rates of aging at age 38 to 45 indicative of or predictive of certain types of phenotypic outcomes? And so first and foremost, they measured a lot of these phenotypic outcomes. At age 45, they measured everything from postural hypertension to bone density scans and muscle mass scans via DEXA imaging. They looked at even speech and noise auditory testing, and a variety of physical function metrics like 30-second chair stands, as well as grip strength, among others. And they even looked at dental imaging, and in a really cool addition to this, they even looked at white matter hyperintensities in brain MRIs. And so in this study was where we started to see some of the really great predictive aspects of this algorithm. So for instance, if you look on the x-axis here, you can see the rate of aging, sort of stratified anywhere from 0 rate of aging to 2, around 2 biological years per year, and then performance on these different metrics. You can see here that one leg balance test was highly correlated with the faster pace of aging, predicting poorer performance. You can also see the same for grip strength as well, and different measurements of muscle mass. You can see the same with cognitive decline and mental processing speeds, and you can actually even see changes on those MRIs as well, where the faster the rate of aging actually predicted lower cortical thickness and surface area of the brain. One of my favorites, and following on OneSkin's talk prior to mine, I also like to show that this also is predictive of things like facial aging. And this is one of my favorite pictures to tell people, because when we talk about methylation algorithms, much of the time, we have a lot of statistics on relative risk, but this is something that people can actually see have a major impact. So these are computer-generated images of all of these members of the cohort at age 45. And you can see the 10 slowest aging members of the cohort on the left and the 10 fastest aging members of the cohort on the right. And even to the layman's eye, you can see that there's a significant difference in the age appearance of these individuals, and most likely because there's actually a significant biological age change, because some of the people at the higher end of the cohort were aging as much as 2 years per year, and the biological age gap can be relatively significant between all of these cohorts. And so this is another way that I just like to show people the impact that aging can have on the inside out, and is especially valuable for a lot of our clinicians. And so this is actually in the health and retirement study, analysis of clocks been sort of talked about as the first 3rd generation clock, because again, its output is a little bit different. And as we talk about 1st and 2nd generation clocks, most people are familiar with the 1st generation clocks being trained against chronological age as an output. That got improved with things like pheno-age and grim-age, where they were training it against phenotypic outcomes, which were more predictive of some of those phenotypes of aging. And unfortunately, because grim GrimAge and PhenoAge have not been licensed commercially, really the dundedinPoAm at this point is the only metric that's been phenotypically trained, which is out there and available for commercial use. And so it is available and able to be used in clinic for a lot of these metrics, and not just research. And so the other question we sort of want to talk about is a comparison to other clocks. And with that, I like to use another study by the same team of researchers by Dr. Belsky, Moffitt, and Caspi, which sort of investigated a lot of these age-related metrics compared to each other to see if they were measuring the same thing. And the results of this were really suggested that they all captured different processes in the aging process. And so so it's hard a lot of times to compare apples to apples whenever we're talking about these aging clocks, as they might all capture different processes. And I think that's important to mention, when we're comparing and trying to figure out which one is the better algorithm. However, this was even compared at looking in this health and retirement study to other measures of epigenetic accelerated aging. And you can see here that probably the two best phenotypic predictors, GrimAge and then also this dundedinPoAm, were probably the most highly correlated with an R-squared value of 0.64, meaning that they're capturing some element of epigenetic aging that is really indicative of some of these age-related phenotypes. You can also see this here as you look at the standard mean, standard deviation, and minimum max of some of these age acceleration values. And the one thing we want to draw attention to here is that the data reviewed in this study was from a previous Dunedin PACE algorithm, the 38 version, which has now been updated to the 45 version, which is significantly more accurate. But even here, you can see that the standard deviation is relatively low. Again, this is a little bit of a misnomer because some of these are trained in biological age in years versus the biological year per year. But you can see it's a relatively small standard deviation. And I think there's one takeaway about this entire algorithm. It is the sensitivity of this algorithm. And it's also illustrated here as you look at the intracast correlations between these measurements. And so for those of you who are not familiar with ICC values, they are essentially measurements showing relationship of measurements of the same group. And so the best way I can put it is if you measure the same sample twice, what is the reliability that you would get sort of metrics that are very close to each other? And the dundedinPoAm 4X is an ICC value that is significantly better than almost all of the previous age clocks. And that's sort of shown here with a ICC value over 0.91. And so it is incredibly accurate. This is now sort of in flux now that Morgan Levine's sort of lab from Yale just introduced principal component analysis to some of these other clocks. And so that should be published here shortly, and we can compare those ICC values. But for now, the dundedinPoAm has the highest ICC value, which makes it very precise and great for measuring interventions at one time point to another, and can really reduce that margin of error to make sure that we can measure in shorter durations to understand how these things are impacting or how any type of intervention is impacting us in a clinical phenotype in a relatively short amount of time. I also wanted to show, that this is also being validated in saliva. I think this is important to mention because the saliva is not yet a valid or reliable metric to measure this at the moment, but some of the studies have been done on this. And so we're hoping to have a saliva-based version of this here in the relatively near future with some of our saliva-based deconvolution algorithms as a control. And so generally, the one benefit of this is it's incredibly precise and able to really assess change in a little bit of a better way. And we'll talk about that as we talk about some of the things we found in that Calorie Trial I mentioned earlier. And the other thing I should mention is that this cohort was not confounded by generational exposures or effects. So for instance, some of the people in the cohorts for some of the original algorithms might have lived where leaded gasoline was frequent and popular, or antibiotic exposure was less frequent. And so this cohort is not confounded by those same generational exposures, which might make it a little bit more accurate as well. And hopefully that will be proven out as this dundedinPoAm 45 or PACE of aging metric is incorporated into more trials. And so running out of time here relatively quickly, I want to go ahead and talk about what this algorithm has taught us. And I think that these might be some of the most exciting things. I think first and foremost, this idea of this sort of innovative idea of early life adversity leading to accelerated aging is something that we in our work at True Diagnostic are finding a lot. We're finding it in the imprintome with differential methylated regions due to prenatal stress. But we're also seeing the same with this dundedinPoAm rate of aging algorithm, and as it's been published in several trials. Here we can see that even early life adversity can actually affect this rate of aging. You can look at things like family social class or the extent of polyvictimization. And you can see that as stress or socioeconomic stress gets higher, performance on this rate of aging gets worse. You tend to age at a faster rate, which is corroborated by another study as well, which looks at this and shows that, again, the rate of aging tends to go up as socioeconomic disadvantages in societal or neighborhood areas tends to go up as well, which leads to this idea that maybe it's the sort of the socioeconomic or environment which is causing this accelerated aging, which is actually leading to worse phenotypes. And one of the other things I should mention is that this is another sort of feature of this algorithm, which is relatively exclusive to this algorithm. Unlike the other algorithms, the dundedinPoAm was able to associate and sort of account for these changes in socioeconomic factors. As I mentioned as well, though, I also wanted to go into the results of that Calorie Trial. And again, this is that double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial looking at 25% caloric restriction over the course of 2 years. And you can see here in sort of the change of the KDM biological age over the course of these 2 years. And you can see how it affected those with fast aging rates versus slow aging rates. And you can see that that obviously those people who did a caloric restriction intervention were significantly improved in their aging rates from this measurement. That's also shown here in comparison to some of those aging algorithms. So you can see that the Dunedin PACE algorithm, or that 4X algorithm, detected more slowing of aging after treatment than generation 1 and 2 clocks. And so what this again allows us to see is that this is a great metric for evaluating interventional treatment. And I think that's what we're all here today, is to find some great biomarkers and some great treatments which we can validate via a multitude of multi-omic markers and phenotypic markers. And I think for epigenetics, this is a great one to incorporate. I should also mention that it also has some other benefits. It's particularly good at differentiating between cognitive impairment and dementia. So its effect on the brain and being able to predict brain outcomes, for instance, even IQ or processing speeds, or some of those MRI surface area cortex valuables we saw earlier. It is great at, and does have a sort of a specific connection to measurements of cognitive dysfunction. And so again, it is more research definitely needs to be done there, but it does look to be really highly precise, sensitive to interventions, and particularly those that involve the brain. And so if anyone would ever like to use this, again, feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to share it with researchers so they can do their own research. We've also done a lot of our own research. Particularly, we've looked at longitudinal changes with COVID-19 and looked at how this affected really not just this aging clock, but a multitude of aging clocks. And so we thought it might be worth updating, especially because I was going right before another lecturer who would be talking about the epigenetic effects of SARS-CoV-2. And so just to go ahead and put it there, we saw no changes in these epigenetic aging rates, but we did see shorter telomere length. And we're evaluating this in a multitude of other trials as well. So we're doing a little bit of everything. As I mentioned, we have over 25 now approved clinical trials. We're doing some of the things found here and many others. And if anyone has any requests to collaborate, I would love to talk a little bit more. And then just sort of to wrap it up, the absolute risk of this are also very predictive. Even if you're slightly above 1 on this pace of aging, you would actually increase your risk of death by 56% over the next 7 years and increase your risk of a chronic disease diagnosis by 54% over the next 7 years. And so we do believe that this is something that can be used both clinically and in research to help us find the best aging interventions. And know that I rushed through that a little bit to try to get through all the information, but would love to answer any questions.
Ryan. Thank you, Ryan. We have time for maybe one question. We have a question from Brian Chen online. What is the R squared between the epigenetic test and the Dunedin PACE using non-epigenetic data in independent data sets?
So that's a hard question to answer because the data sets don't necessarily exist. I would point to the health and retirement study, which actually correlated each of the aging algorithms to the other aging algorithms to give you that R squared value via the health and retirement study. That was published by Dr. Crimmins from USC, and would be probably the best place to find that information or something similar to it.
All right, thank you. There's another question by Ronald Cutler that I would like to ask, but give us a slight twist on. He asks, what can we learn from the CPG sites that were used to calculate aging pace? And can I add on that, what is the sites that are most predictive for dementia?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and unfortunately, there still needs to be a lot of work done there, particularly comparing it to things like sort of genome, sort of just regular genetics. I will say that there is actually no crossover in CPGs from this algorithm to any of the other aging algorithms, and so again, it's hard to sort of diagnose which of those CPGs is going to be the most informative, but it doesn't have a lot of crossover, meaning that it's measuring something slightly different than most of the other aging algorithms.
And you don't know anything about the biology?
Not yet. Again, we needed a lot more to do that. There obviously have been things done like using great software to assign biological significance to some of those changing CPGs, but I would say that we don't know enough yet to speculate.
All right. Very, very nice. Thank you, Ryan. Great talk.